popular culture.
Thank you for tuning in to Exeter TV. Exeter TV is the
Kunis, the co-executive director of the Exeter Historical Society. We're going to pause just a moment for our land acknowledgement. Tonight's program takes place in Misquamscook, now called Exeter, in Nadakana, the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abnaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples past and present. We acknowledge and honor with gratitude the Elnabak, the people, who have stewarded Nadakana and its Aki, Nibi, Olaquakak, and Owasak, the land, the waterways, flora, and fauna throughout the generations.
Thank you, Barbara. My name is Laura Martin. I'm the co-executive director of the Historical Society, and I'd like to thank you for coming tonight, joining us both in person and virtually to learn about LGBTQ plus past, our LGBTQ plus past. I'm going to trip over that a few times tonight, I'm afraid. I'd like to make a few quick announcements. Our Window to the Past exhibit is open through mid-November, and we'll have an open house this coming Friday, November 10th, from 4 to 7 p.m. Even if you've already seen it, we encourage you to come by and check it out and socialize a bit. Please check out our Facebook page or the events page on our website for more of our activities in the next few weeks. In December, we will gather at the Exeter Historical Society building on Tuesday the 5th at 6:30 p.m. for our annual holiday open house, and we hope to see you there. Tonight, if you'd like to ask a question and you're here in person, please raise your hand and wait for one of us to come to you with a microphone. Not only will it help our speakers hear you, but it will also allow those online to hear you as well. If you are on Zoom or Facebook, please put your question in the comments section and we'll try to ask it on your behalf. And now I'd like to introduce tonight's speakers. Holly Cashman is professor of Spanish in the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures, and a core faculty member in Women's and Gender Studies at the University of New Hampshire. She currently serves as co-coordinator of Queer Studies. Her research focuses on Spanish in the U.S., bilingual conversation, queer linguistics, and impoliteness. She won the Kidder Award for Faculty in 2019, which honors those who foster greater understanding of sexual orientation and gender expression at UNH. Tom Kaufhold is the founder of the Seacoast, New Hampshire LGBT History Project. Tom and Holly have worked together on the Seacoast, New Hampshire LGBTQ Oral History Project, which grew out of a larger history project that Tom founded in the years approaching the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall riots in 1969. Considered by many the birth of the modern LGBTQ plus rights movement. He has worked for many years gathering items of significance to the LGBTQ plus community and curated an exhibit at the Portsmouth Athenaeum and Portsmouth Library in 2019. Thank you both for being here. I'm going to hand it over to you.
You can move that. Good evening. It's great to see you all here tonight. It works. I founded the Seacoast LGBT History Project in 2015 because I had a lot of stuff from my activist days in the early 90s living in Portsmouth, and I didn't want to throw it all out. And I had gotten to know some of the people at the Portsmouth Athenaeum, and I asked them, would you take this stuff if I collected it? And they said, sure. So I created a group, and with a little... what would you call this? Our, what are we here for? To collect, preserve, and present the artifacts and stories of the LGBTQ people of the Seacoast of New Hampshire. Our language keeps changing. When I started the project, I wanted to use gay history project in quotes, and our first meeting, people said, "You got to change it." So I went with LGBT, which was what the corporation I was working at was using at the time. Within a year, they changed it to LGBTQ, and now I think the standard is LGBTQ+. So you'll see it used throughout. We're really just trying to be inclusive. So, and what I thought I would do tonight is talk a little bit about some of the research we've done. But before I do that, I'd like to start with a thank you. The project is run by all volunteers. None of us are paid. And so on the left is the original committee of people that helped collect stuff, help get the word out, and help set up all the exhibits. And on the right are UNH interns. Some of those are actually paid. And the staff at the Portsmouth Public Library, the Portsmouth Athenaeum, and the Portsmouth Historical Society have all been very helpful through this last 8 years. It's supposed to have been a 5-year project. I'm on year 8. I thought I would talk a little bit about how we've done some of our research, and then as I'm talking about the things that we found, kind of say, how did we find this out, or how do we know about this? There's lots of ways to research, as you all know. And one of the things that I realized after I collected all this stuff is the real work begins, because you've got to sort through it all, you got to decide how to display it, you got to catalog it all, and it takes forever, which is why we're on year 8. But one of the ways we found out about different people and different events was just other people. And Holly will talk more about our oral histories, but that was a great way to just ask people, like, what was this person like when he was here? You know, what it was like living here in Portsmouth. Another way we find out about queer history is through diaries and letters and people's personal papers, and I'll give some examples of that. Other LGBTQ archives, there's other universities and other organizations that have quite a large online presence, so you can do research there. Newsletters are a great source of information. And the Secretary of State, if you're researching a business, which we were doing quite a bit of, trying to figure out what our clubs started and things like that in Portsmouth. And then city directories, I have one here actually. And really the city directory is just what it says. It has everything that's in the city listed, either by business, and then they also listed by address. So if you know an address of something, you can look up that address and say, what was there? What else was there at the time? So those are very handy. The first story I wanted to talk about, I'm not going to go to the next slide yet, was the Charlie Howard story. And Charlie Howard was born and raised in Portsmouth. He was born in 1961. He went to school in Portsmouth through elementary, middle, and high school. And he was extremely bullied. He was very effeminate. He was very out. And he used to carry a purse and wear heels, and he was bullied at school to the point where he didn't participate in his graduation in 1981. He said, I'm not going to be humiliated as I cross the stage. And we learned a lot about Charlie from one of his friends who happened to be his teacher and who took him camping and really got to be a mentor for him. And Charlie loved to do photography. This was a time of Polaroids with the instant, pullouts. And he loved to work in the nursery, the gardening nursery at the school, and he loved to work in the culinary arts. When he graduated in 81, he moved to Bangor, Maine, and there he found a community at the Unitarian Church. He joined a group called Interweave, and they were a support group for LGBTQ people. And one night after the 4th of July potluck, he and his friend decided to walk downtown to get their mail. And as they were walking along, this carload of teenagers came along and started chasing them down. And the 3 boys got out of the car and chased after Charlie and his friend. His friend got away. Charlie had asthma, so he couldn't run very fast. They caught up with him on the State Street Bridge in Bangor, and they picked him up and threw him off the bridge. The whole time he was saying, I can't swim, I can't swim. And they found his body the next morning. I start with this because it's the worst story I'll tell all night, so let's get it over with. But when we were researching Charlie, there's a lot written about, what happened in Maine after he was killed, what happened to the people that killed him, and all this stuff. And there was very little written about what was Charlie like when he lived in Portsmouth. And one of the things we found out was that his mother didn't want to put a marker on his grave. He's buried in Kittery, Maine, just about a mile from downtown Portsmouth. And his mother didn't want to put a marker on his grave because she was afraid it was going to get defaced. So she left it unmarked. And so when we found that out, we said we really should do something, even though it wasn't really in our charter to, create monuments or memorials. But this is a picture of, up in the upper left is Charlie. This is him at school with his, I think he's got a camera and a picture in his hands. So we decided to raise some money to put in a marker on his Kittery grave. And one of the things when people used to say, and this was throughout his life, when people said, like the teachers said to him, Charlie, if you just wore something less flamboyant, if you just tone it down a little bit. And his response was always, well, this is who I am. And so we put that on his marker, this is who I am. We were able to raise enough money so that we were able to create 2 memorial benches. So in the lower left-hand corner, that's the bench that's at the Portsmouth High School, and that's surrounded by the students from the Gender Sexuality Alliance who did a dedication ceremony in 2020. And on the lower right is the one that's in downtown Portsmouth. It's in Commercial Alley, so he really loved to hang out downtown Portsmouth, so we really wanted something downtown. And we really wanted something that would be used, and it's used quite often there. We held a memorial service for him in 2019, which would have been the 35th anniversary of his death. And we raised more money for all of our memorials and our benches. We raised enough so that we gave the city of Portsmouth $500 in trust to kind of take care of, maintain the bench in case anything happens. So that's really one of our great success stories. And it's really about, what do you do when you find out something happened here in history? How do we honor somebody that grew up here in Portsmouth that was killed in Bangor? Bangor has a very nice memorial for it. They've had, memorial walks and everything else. And we really felt Portsmouth should do something. So we did something, and that was good. The next one was, so we learned a lot about Charlie from meeting his friend Bob Lister, who was the principal and teacher and eventually became mayor. Here's another one we kind of learned about when we were at Portsmouth Pride one day. This woman named Joan came up and started talking about the loaf and ladle at Exeter. And so I have a little picture of the loaf and ladle there. And the thing that you can do, so on the left-hand side, that's from the Secretary of State. So if you go to the New Hampshire government page and you look up, you can do a business name lookup, and that's all I did. I just put in loaf and ladle, and I did a little filing history on it, and it was created in 1973. Right here in Exeter on Water Street. And one of the stories she told us was that she taught the Stonewall boys how to make crackers. She gave them all her recipes for making crackers. So the Stonewall boys were Jonathan King and Jim Stott, who started selling jams and jellies at the Portsmouth Farmers Market in the early 90s. And when they needed a name for their business, they looked outside of their kitchen window and there was a stone wall. So they called it the Stonewall Kitchen. And, now it's nationwide, international, actually. But anyway, so her story, we'd love to get some of her oral history one of these days. But that's, I didn't really know about the loaf and ladle. I knew about the place, but I didn't know the connection with Stonewall and with Joan. So it was great to just be able to talk to her about that. Here's a couple Seacoast area people that we can learn a lot from their letters and diaries. The people on the left are Sarah Orne Jewett and Annie Fields. They met in 1880 on Star Island. Both writers, poets, and they started their friendship, and it blossomed after Annie lost her husband, and I think Sarah lost her dad. So we started spending a lot of time together, and it really blossomed into a relationship which was called a Boston marriage. So this was at the turn of the century. So when two women were living together in a loving relationship, they called it a Boston marriage. I don't know if one of them had to be from Boston, but Annie Fields was. And that lasted till 1909 when Sarah passed away, and Annie passed away in 1915. On the right is the painter Russell Cheney and Frank Otis Matheson. They met in 1924 on a transatlantic voyage. Cheney was a painter. Matheson is an educator. And they immediately became hooked up, you might say. They immediately became partners, and there's about 3,000 letters that had been saved that have gone between the two of them. They were together, they met in 1924. Russell died in 1945. So they were together for 21 years. And what's interesting about trying to research LGBTQ plus history is they didn't call themselves LGBT, they didn't call themselves gay. They really understood themselves as the intermediate sex. There was a book that F.A.A. Matheson's read about the intermediate sex, which was this kind of go-between. You're a male, but you feel like a female. And that's kind of how they saw themselves. So, you can't just go, well, I'm going to look up gay in the people's diary, because they didn't use those terms. So trying to do research prior to, 1900, you're really kind of guessing as to what these relationships were like. But these two were very much a partnership and a pair. Unfortunately, when Russell died, Matheson really couldn't handle it. They called each other rat and devil. I don't know which one's the rat and which one's the devil. But he committed suicide like 5 years later in 1950. He just couldn't handle. He started drinking a lot, and et cetera. Breaking up is hard to do. The next one is, I won't talk about too much, but there's an archive at UNH, if you weren't aware. And actually, one of the very first social groups or gay groups in New Hampshire was the Gay Student Organization at UNH in 1973. And that celebrating 50 years this year. And there was I left a link there, there's a great article on the UNH magazine, and they just had another great article in the alumni magazine just about the Gay Student Organization that started in 73. It's a great story about how the governor tried to get funding removed from the Gay Student Organization in 73 when he found out that they were having dances. And so the university pulled funding for any of their social events, and the Gay Student Organization took UNH and New Hampshire to court. And they won. And it was settled in 1975, and the court said you can't deny them funding for their social events. What's particular about this is that when you talk to other universities and you talk to their archivists, they mention this as kind of being instrumental in getting their gay student organization together, or just making it more visible and being more empowered. They felt more empowered because of that. Speaking of other archives, the University of Southern Maine in Portland has an amazing online LGBTQ archive. They have an amazing archive in general. But one of the things when we were researching our Seacoast Area Gay Alliance, which was a group that was around from like 1974 to 1975, and it really was the Seacoast. It wasn't like just New Hampshire. They met in York, Maine. They met in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. They really were a bunch of college kids that got together and had potlucks once in a while. And according to one of the people, they didn't really accomplish much, but they had meetings and they were able to connect with each other. When I was trying to research, like, when did that really happen and where were they meeting, I came upon this little thing. in the Gay Community News in February of 1975, and it said Exeter, New Hampshire, and I was like, what? There was something in Exeter, New Hampshire in 1975. It was a newly formed gay women's rap group, and it was going to meet at 27 Water Street. Does anybody know what's at 27 Water Street? Loaf and Ladle? Oh, was it probably Loaf and Ladle? That would probably make sense. Somebody should Google that right away. Their first meeting was Tuesday, February 11th in 1975. And there's a couple things. The Gay Community News was a newspaper out of Boston. And there was, I think, 2 other newspapers out of Boston, Bay Windows and maybe another one. But this was how you found out what was going on. You got the gay newspaper and you found out what was going on. And so there was a lot of, this is how we research and say, oh, where's this Seacoast Area Gay Alliance met on Court Street in Portsmouth? And that's when I came upon this one. And one of the things I find interesting is that really, they use the same arguments over and over again when some new group comes along. So if you look up in the upper right there, it says child molester with a question mark on page 6. You know, all these complaints about bathrooms and who uses what bathroom. They always say, what about the children? And, you know, and that's been going on since day one. There are no new arguments. It's just a new group that they target. Skip ahead. All right. One of the things that we used a lot when we were researching the bars and club scene in Portsmouth was a Secretary of State site. With the New Hampshire liquor laws, if you're not serving food, you have to be a private club. And when we were researching the Seaport Club, which was started in 1956, it actually started earlier, but the important thing is it started in 1956 as a Seaport Club doing business as the Acropolis Greek Club. So it was a Greek club in 1956, and they were here where the press room is. This is on Daniel Street in Portsmouth. It's across from where the post office used to be. And the clubs were on the 2nd and 3rd floor. The first floor, when they started, was a furniture, and it turned into like a biker bar. But in order to get to that 2nd floor, you used a door where it looks like there's almost somebody standing in the doorway, but by the car. Use that doorway, went upstairs, knocked on the door, and somebody peeked out and made sure you were okay and let you into the club. When we did some oral histories, we found out that the person that eventually bought the Seaport Club liquor license was told that when the Greek club started here, their membership was pretty low and they needed to bring in more members or start another club, so they invited the gay people in. And the gay people started their own club called the Sagamore Club. And we know from looking at the state records that the Seaport Club started in 1956. We know by looking at these city directories, going through them year by year, that the Sagamore Club shows up in 1959. So somewhere between 1956 and 1959, the Sagamore Club was created and used the liquor license that the Seaport Club had. Confused? So are we. But one of the things that people kept saying over and over again was, the Sagamore Club used to be down on, Lafayette Road. I remember going there back in the 70s, and it was like, finally, I found it again in the city directories, looking up the address, that it did move to Lafayette Road for 2 years in the early 70s, and then it moved back to here at 70 Daniel Street. And I just point that out because that's, it was like an oral part of a history, and what people were saying kind of forced you to go back and look at what other evidence there was to support what they were saying. Because it's amazing how quickly we forget things. Anyway, that's that club. One of the other clubs was the Women's Bar on Pleasant Street in Portsmouth. This was the old federal building in downtown Portsmouth. This is a big granite building Right now, there's a Five Thai Bistro is there. It's next to Book and Bar, across the street from, I don't know what's across the street, Piscataway West Savings Bank. But this started in 1980. Two women wanted to open a bar in Portsmouth, and at the time, this little space here on the right was an auto parts store, downtown Portsmouth parts store. Who knew? And they went into the basement because that's what they were going to rent, the basement, and there was all these mufflers and stuff hanging on the ceiling. They literally had to crawl on their hands and knees to look at the space. And being the handy women that they were, they said, we can make this work. So they made it work for 7 years. And they didn't have a liquor license when they first opened in 1980. But they had 75 women show up the first night. They opened on New Year's Eve, and they had 75 people show up without any booze. Very nice. They became so successful that they moved into the floor where the Five Thai Bistro is, too. So upstairs, they'd have couches and serve popcorn and food, and downstairs was the dance club. And one of the things that I mentioned that we like to look at is newsletters when we're trying to do our research. And who knew, but Iris had this newsletter they put out, Prismatica. And this one is from 1984, August of 1984. And you can really read like everything that's going on at the club, all the different things that, all the different people that were coming in to perform. And then it's also interesting, you can kind of look at all the ads, all the advertisements that are in the newsletter and say, what were people advertising in 1984? And a lot of them were therapists coming out, psychotherapists, clinical psychologists, Clarence's Chowder House, the Gunkwit House. So you can kind of get a sense of what businesses were supporting the LGBT community back then. And then you can also find out that, who knew, but right down here at the bottom of this page, it says WebWork, a contact and friendship network for New England lesbians. For membership information, send a self-addressed stamp envelope to WebWork in Calais, Maine. So if somebody was researching like what was going on in Calais, Maine, for the LGBT community, they could look at this newsletter from Portsmouth and say, oh, some group was going on. How do we find out more about that? What can we find out about WebWork? Sounds like WeWork, which just went bankrupt, but that's another story. I wanted to talk about PFLAG, Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, the very first New Hampshire chapter. So this is a national organization that was created for parents, a support group for parents that had LGBTQ people, children, and it kind of morphed into let's invite their friends, and they really opened it up. Anyone could really go if they wanted to. And the first chapter in New Hampshire was in 1985 in Concord. And there was a lot of people coming from the Seacoast to go to that, and they decided, well, why don't we start our own group? So I'm going to mention some names. Some of you will probably know some of these names. Nora Tuthill, Peggy Gage, Sally Wool, Betty Batchelor. Those are some of the four women that helped form this organization on the Seacoast, and they formed their own chapter in 1991. It's still going on today. It's morphed into somewhat online and all that other stuff, and it's moved around. It's been in Stratham where it started, and it's gone up to Rochester, and I think the last time I heard it was somewhere down in Hampton. Anyway, they met at the Stratham Community Church, right by the Circle on 108. And they had a very large collection of videos, VHS, if you know what that is, and a very large collection of books that they used to lend out. I mean, because at the time, the early 90s, a lot of libraries didn't carry the LGBTQ books, so they created their own lending library. We ended up with that library. And it was a lot of stuff. But a lot of what there was in their VHS tapes was they recorded anything that had anything to do with LGBTQ people when it was on TV. So you might get, Nightline was talking to somebody, Phil Donahue was talking to somebody, any of the talk shows or 60 Minutes. So we have all of that stuff, and we made copies of all that stuff, and it's available at the Portsmouth Public Library. So if you go there now at the Portsmouth Public Library, you want to look up their digital archives. And the rest of it, I think we recycled most of it. We cataloged it all. We had like 105 videos. Most of them you could get off the shelf, The Bird Cage, La Cage aux Faux, any of the ones that we could get, we just recycled them. But we kept a copy of everything they had. And the same with the books. We actually donated all the books to the National Archives down in Fort Lauderdale. Anything that had to do with New Hampshire, we kind of made a copy of the cover and the title page and all that, and the chapter that might have had something to do with New Hampshire, and then donated the book. But I talk about PFLAG because they're still going on, but in 1993, they had a conference at UNH called Respect All Youth, and it was designed for teachers, principals, pediatricians, therapists, anyone that was dealing with youth. And it was designed to teach them how to deal with LGBTQ youth. And at the very end of the conference, people were like, well, what can we do? What can we possibly do? And one of the speakers said, well, why don't you start an outright group? So that started in 1993, Seacoast Outright, and it's still going on today. So it's 30 years this year. And what's interesting about that is the conference was in March, I believe it was March, and they started meeting right afterwards saying, okay, how do we get this organization going? What should we do? And there were two camps. One was like, let's just open our doors and see what happens. And the other camp was like, let's line up all of our ducks and everything, get everything in a row and get all of our, protocols in place. So we're going to do background checks. We're going to do, always have two people. So they really created a great framework to protect the youth. And they opened their doors in September of 1993. And the people that were helping them across the country, supporting their efforts said, don't expect much. The first couple months, just getting the word out is going to be pretty hard. And that first meeting, they had like 7 kids show up. So they knew they were onto something. And like I said, it's still going on today. And in 2015, they started doing Portsmouth Pride. All right, the last, I don't know, I'm trying to think of what my next slide is. Okay, that's Holly. I'm going to go back. Because I want to talk about one group, because it was kind of on the advertisement for this, was the Dover GLBT group. And I don't have their banner. We had their banner, but I didn't bring that with me tonight. I just brought a poster. This was their first annual cruise. It was a 2-hour cruise. The Dover group, that was the first group that tried to combine the men and women together. There was a group for men, Seacoast Gay Men, that started in 1979 that was meeting in Portsmouth, and is still meeting today. It's coming up on its 45th year. There was a women's group, Out and About, that started in 1993 that was meeting, and this was the first group to really bring everyone together, and it was in Dover. And it was the first group to include transgendered people. And they were very successful. They survived for 10 years, and they were doing a lot of activities like this, Christmas parties and that kind of thing. And they also set up some helplines and all kinds of things like that. So it was a very successful group. And I just wanted to point that out because, it was part of your advertising. And one last one. Just because it's nice. James Haller. Has anyone heard of James Haller? He lived in New York City. In 1970, he moved to Portsmouth and said, I'm going to open a restaurant. And what was crazy about it was he said, I'm going to do 2 seatings, one at 6 and one at 9. He saw this happening in New York City, and people were like, you're crazy, this is Portsmouth, we have chowder houses, we're very much a blue-collar town, and but he did. He opened a restaurant called the Blue Strawberry. It was down on Ceres Street, right where the tugboats are, right where they dock, right across the street from them. He opened his restaurant called the Blue Strawberry, and it was extremely successful. It went on for 15 years. And he and his 2 partners are credited with really starting the restaurant revolution, renaissance in Portsmouth. So his name is James Haller, Buddy Haller. He's still around. He's written a number of books, cookbooks, and he just came out with one talking about all the strange people he met on Ceres Street in Portsmouth. And now I'm going to turn it over to Holly to talk about the oral history stuff.
Thank you. I'm glad that the forward button is the big one. Good. So I kind of can zip through a couple of these introductory slides because they were kind of more methodologically focused, and I think especially for a historical society audience, this might be a little bit too basic. So I'd rather focus a little bit more on why oral history, and also why do queer history. And I know that for different generations, the word queer can kind of land differently. I'm using it as a way of being inclusive and avoiding using all of the letters and leaving some out and all of that. But I do want to acknowledge that I know for some folks it still is a problematic word to hear. But as Tom has already alluded to in his talk, oral history can help kind of fill out the historical record, can send us back into the archive or back into other sources once we find something that maybe didn't fit with the research we'd already done. And it's really a way of just kind of valuing the everyday, ordinary experiences of people. And that also kind of relates to one of the biggest challenges I have doing oral history is people always telling me that their stories aren't important and that they never did anything important, and me trying to convince them that that's not true. And so for members of the LGBTQ plus community, oral history is particularly important because so many of the things haven't been recorded and haven't been captured through traditional means. And some of this is even very intentional, where people's letters or other things that would identify them in a way that was not accepted at the time were specifically destroyed at their request upon their death. And so to focus on this last paragraph here of this quote, it's a way for queer communities to capture and record their heritage. And that's not only to have a fuller picture of the past, although that's very important, but it's also for us today and people in the future to know that queer people have always existed, even if labels change and identities change. And to have that history and that knowledge can be important for people in terms of their own lives and their own identities. And that's what motivates me to do the work that I do, kind of wanting to be the adult that I didn't have as a queer kid growing up, and wanting to have the representation that I didn't see when I was growing up. So recruiting participants, as I said, is a big challenge. Recording and transcribing can be especially the transcribing, can be very time consuming. I'm happy to report that at least for the next 2 years, we've completely solved this problem, because we have access now to a fantastic software program that uses AI and can record or can transcribe an interview in a matter of minutes in different languages, and like over 95% accurate. But it's expensive, and so that will not last for too long. And then another challenge related to technology is kind of how our oral history is going to be preserved, and wanting to find and connect with institutions that are going to have the commitment and the funding to be able to maintain an archive of oral histories after the project is complete. And so we were very excited to be able to connect with Portsmouth Public Library, who now has the has the oral history archive as part of their digitized collection, and will be adding to it as we go forward. And a big challenge I'm still working with is to represent the diversity of the LGBTQ plus community in the Seacoast region. I started out identifying community elders to speak with, because we were looking at the 50th anniversary of Stonewall Uprising and wanting to interview people who had been around prior to that and could reflect on that. And now, while still wanting to capture stories of that generation, also wanting to capture stories of all generations and different intersectional identities as people might hold them. So this is a little bit of a history that Tom's already given. I've been involved since 2017, and I am not a historian. So I came at this as a sociocultural linguist who has recorded interviews throughout my career for different purposes, for doing linguistic research, and then kind of self-taught what are the differences between that type of interview and oral history narratives. So the project currently boasts 11 oral histories, and that's not a lot considering how long that we've been working on it, but it is a result of this being very much a side project, which I'm happy to report it no longer is. It is now my main project for the next couple of years in order to take advantage of this software we have access to. And we will be interviewing as many people as possible, and encourage anyone who's interested to reach out. If you want to be interviewed or want to tell us someone we should interview, I noticed that Tom always brings up, when we're presenting together, the people that he wants me to interview. So he did that again tonight, and they're on the list. And so of these, at least 4 are now currently available on the Portsmouth Public Library website. And the issues, the topics that come up in the oral histories are varied. One of the other parts in the process of doing oral history after the transcribing is indexing, so identifying what are the different topics people might be interested in, and creating a key to when they come up in the interview that would be searchable in the archive. And I wanted to highlight in particular the 4th item on the left hand, the bars and nightclubs, because this is something that I think we always talk about and don't necessarily talk about why that's so important for this community. And it's one of the things that a couple of my oral history narrators comment on specifically, and we'll get to hear at least one of those clips later. But if you can imagine, a time when you were not able to be out with your family, not able to be out at work, not able to be out with friends and in your neighborhood, the bar for many people became a place that was a safe place, that was a home. And so it kind of takes on an outsized role in a lot of queer history. And it can be really problematic as well, because you see the top of the right-hand column, which also came up. So one of my I think I've never given a presentation without sharing a clip from Joe Murphy, who has since passed away after I've recorded this oral history. And in the clip I'm going to show, he talks about the founding of an organization called Gay Men Fight AIDS in Portsmouth, but he also talked a great deal in his interview about his sobriety and his participation in a group informally called the Gay AA, which started in Durham, moved to Portsmouth, and I am actually not sure if it still meets or where it meets. I wanted to also share, so the two people that are next, Dick, who chose to not have his last name as part of the archive. He was the owner of the Seaport Club, also known as Members, which was one of the gay bars that Tom referred to, and he talks about the importance of the bars as a community space. Randon Eddy, who with her partner Mercy Chick opened Iris in Portsmouth in 1980, that's way too many things. The clip I have is, I believe, it's her describing Iris. That's the one that was the basement of the auto parts store. And then one of the things I always ask people in the oral histories is there any anecdote or any story that hasn't come up that they want to share? And in the case of Joe Est, who was the manager of the bar Members, he talks about the time that the village people came to the bar and how exciting that was. And then I always close with the question of kind of what message do you have to share with youth today or people of the future who might be watching this after we're all gone. And Randa, who was a UNH alum, folk singer in Portsmouth in the 1960s, an actor, had a great answer for that. So we're short on time. I don't know if people have a preference for which clips they would like to see, or if I can't run through all of them quickly, or I can choose for you. Okay. I think they're going to start playing as soon as I click, so I'm going to see if this will work. Oh, I can't do that, and I have to go back. Okay. I just wanted to mention quickly, so this is Dick, who was the owner of Members, Seaport Club, and he talks, he's a lifelong resident of the New Hampshire Seacoast region. I just wanted to point that out, and the oldest participant so far in the archive at the age of 86. Okay, and the one I chose to play does not work. Okay. Okay, so instead we'll listen to Randon. So Randon, since Iris doesn't exist anymore and I'll never have a chance to go there, I asked her to kind of take me through, just describe, I'm coming to this bar, describe it from beginning to end, and I had an ulterior motive doing that, actually, because there's this recreation project where people are trying to recreate these spaces that no longer exist, and so now I have this fantastic description of what Iris looked like.
But you have to go down the steps, which were probably used for unloading product from the other businesses. Ring the bell, even though I had my park and name license, went through the school, whole 9 yards, for a non-resident, that's pretty funny. I preferred to be the reader, because I'm clever, so I got lots
So she goes into a lot of detail, and we don't need to listen to the whole thing, but what I particularly loved about her description was the kind of focusing on the positive part of the fact that this was a private club, that people had to have a membership in order to get in, and that just meant that she got to sit at the door and greet everybody and look at their membership card and give them hugs, rather than kind of focusing on the fact that it was a security measure or an annoying thing that was a limit because of their liquor license. I'm going to skip the village people and end on Randa, so we have time for Q&A. So this is Randa's answer to kind of that message to the future.
I will say that for me, development firms are very available to me. You know, the low self-esteem that comes with being kind of just put down in society for whatever reason. You have to fight so hard and you need friends to support you. So the thing is, I guess what I would say is, who we are is our strength. Who we are is what we have to do to make our community stronger and stronger. And that's the magic. That's the magic. It's when who you are comes out and you can give that away. That's good. That's where it's going to make a difference. And serving and making a difference is the most beautiful thing there is.
So a quick kind of advert for what's next. More interviews, 1-minute history videos are coming up that a graduate student at UNH, Lily Pudlow, has just finished. A map and self-guided tour of LGBTQ Portsmouth on the Clio app. And you can keep track of us in all these ways and look for more events. So I'll end there for Q&A, and thank you so much for hosting us and inviting us to be here, and we're happy to answer any questions.
I had a couple slides that I need to go over first, but we have some of the things we created as part of our exhibits in 2019. We have to lend out if anyone is interested. We've on the lower left, we have some posters that explain the general history of the gay social movements in the United States. So that's pre-Stonewall, post-Stonewall, and there's a whole poster on what was Stonewall and what was that all about. So we have those we can lend out. On the right are panels that we made telling our stories of the LGBTQ people and events on the Seacoast. They're in the rainbow colors, so there's 6 of them, and we have those to lend out. If anyone's interested. A couple other things that we do, as Holly said, we have the Oral History Project going. There is a walking tour in Portsmouth that happens the second Sunday of every month from May to October. Our audio-video archives, besides the oral histories, are available at the Portsmouth Public Library, and we do a Rainbow Symposium in October at the Portsmouth Historical Society in Portsmouth. And like Holly said,
History Month.
Yeah, and you can like us on Facebook, or there's our email if you need to email us with anything.
So
now we can take questions.
that's a good segue to my question. You have given a lot of URLs and locations and addresses and so on. Is there any way you could put that in a text, and maybe the Historical Society could put it in one of their newsletters?
Absolutely.
I'm a member. I'm an authority with the Historical Society.
I'm more than happy to share that with folks to disseminate it in whatever way would be helpful to reach people.
Okay, and especially the interviews, because you're soliciting for more people.
Yes, absolutely. And the call for oral history narrators, absolutely.
Okay. I'd be fascinated to know what queer linguistics are, but anyway, when did the term gay become prevalent, and was it self-identifying, or did that come from outside and then was adopted by the community?
take this, or you want me to take this?
We can both-
I can answer about queer linguistics first, but we could also talk afterwards about that.
I can tell you that the word homosexual didn't come about until the late 1800s. So prior to that, I'm sure there was words for men loving men and women loving women. I don't know. I mean, I want to say probably the 60s, 50s, 60s is when gay started really meaning that we're happy queer people.
So you have, like, in the 1950s, you have the formation of early kind of predecessors of queer rights organizations, and using words like homophile, right, rather than gay, and then you start hearing gay coming out a lot. That was an accident. Yeah, in the 60s, right, with like gay power and leading, and then gay became kind of the umbrella word that was in a lot of titles of organizations post Stonewall. But it wasn't the only way people were self-identifying. But even the idea of an like a stable identity related to sexuality is a relatively new invention. So queer linguistics is an approach to studying language practices, not just of people who identify as LGBTQ+, but of studying language practices in a way that kind of questions and takes a critical stance towards anything that's normative. So kind of asking like how people identify and how these identifying practices can come about, and what kind of power and what kind of way they regulate people's identities and behaviors. And it can also be studying the language practices of LGBTQ+ people.
Thank you. I wanted to ask, because I had this conversation with someone a while back. So you talked about a Boston marriage, and it was a thing that I sort of knew about from, I don't know, something I read at some point somewhere. Was there ever a male equivalent, or was that somehow just something that was like okay for women but not okay for men?
Do you want? We've never done this joint Q&A before. It's so funny. Thank you. So I think the term Boston marriage was specifically used for women, but I think there were definitely, cases you can point to in the past of similar relationships that were not seen as sexual relationships or not seen as romantic relationships between men. But I'm not thinking that the same terminology was used. Yeah, there wasn't like a New York marriage or a Detroit marriage or like some other, no. Yeah. And, go ahead, yeah, Maggie.
Gender into that. If you bring in gender to that, men can get away with a lot more in that, whereas women had social expectations on them with marriage. So there's a little more freedom as a man. That wouldn't have been as unusual to see two men together.
So men were just friends, and they could just be friends, and that was fine. Yeah.
Thank you both. I think I have two questions or comments. I don't know yet, but and I don't want to give you more work either. So I want to precede that. I don't want to but it's regarding also to the first comment, and I don't know if it's like too much of like an academics question or not. But thinking about like ways to disseminate the project, there is so much stuff, links, everything happening. Have you thought about, and because this is the archive, and I think archives are messy, and I do like that, but at the same time, I don't think other people should like what we like, but a way to deliver information that could be more accessible to a general audience, at the same time that you are also sharing primary sources. That would be my first one. I mean, it could be a website or something. Like, you have a lot of like locations, so I think I have a lot of images in my head right now happening, but like mapping tools could be great.
The Clio app is something we've been working with through UNH's Summer Institute in Public Humanities, and the founder of that, David Trowbridge, has come to UNH a whole bunch, and so I have an embarrassing number of half-written Clio map entries because I was waiting for the oral histories to plug in clips talking so that you can basically, with this app, you can have your smartphone, you can be at a place wherever you are, open it up and see kind of what's there, and click on the different descriptions and kind of publicly sourced history knowledge. And so you can also link them together to make a tour in a given location. So I highly recommend, not paid at all to advertise this app. The founder isn't paid for it either. He just wants to get people to love and learn more about history. And so that's one way that we're definitely working toward getting that. Right now, Tom is doing live in-person walking tours in the summer months through October. But that would be a resource that would be kind of anytime, any person who wanted to access it that had a smartphone. And then all the oral histories will be available through the Portsmouth Public Library, but not everyone wants to sit down and listen to an entire hour and a half, and so getting a kind of public-facing kind of clips and artfully arranged is definitely high on the priority list.
And I just want to say that when I started the project, one of the things I didn't want to do was a website, and I didn't want to do Facebook either. But none of us did. But no, really, my goal was to get the institutions that were already existing in Portsmouth to have our stuff. You know what I mean? I didn't want to be kind of a separate. I wanted to try to get into there. So, and this is why the Portsmouth Athenaeum has most of our paper stuff, newspapers, newsletters, and that kind of thing. The library, because the Athenaeum didn't want all the audio video stuff, the library stepped up and said, we will take that. And so, and now the way I approach something, if somebody comes to me and says, I have this to donate, like I have this sign from Iris that's been sitting on my barn for 40 years, do you want it? My first thought is to go to the Portsmouth Historical Society because it's a physical object. And then so if something media comes in, it goes to the library. If something paper, it goes. So that's kind of, what we started that way because we didn't, and I was just telling Holly before, I said, our first slide should have me fading out on the left and her going up on the right. That in the future, we'll still be around, but we'll be more like just a catalyst to get things going and a place that people can come and say, here, I have stuff, and I'll just bring it over here. But, yeah.
Because my second question, I think it does relate a little bit to it, but I think there's so much potential for educational resources with primary sources like this that we normally don't use, and I'm including myself as an educator. So while you were talking, I was envisioning that it could be kind of like another way to bring this to the youth and to kind of like create lesson plans, disseminate those lesson plans and stuff like that. That's.
definitely something that's been in everything I want to do. Right now is a really challenging time to ask K through 12 teachers, both because of the pandemic and the current political climate, but it's definitely in the future plans.
So I noticed, one thing I noticed about the presentation is that a lot of it talks about people who are self-identified as LGBTQ and are open about it and so forth. And I'm wondering, does your archive, do you include materials from times like, I know, for example, a lot of times when you're trying to find gay history, you might read obituaries or something like that, where somebody's quote-unquote longtime companion, is mentioned sort of in passing at the end. And so I know that's a very different kind of finding out what history there is. And I'm just wondering if what you have includes that kind of thing, or is that a different sort of realm of this research?
Well, for the oral histories, it's people who are at least identifying now at the point in their life that they're being interviewed in that way, although people do still have control over how much they want to identify themselves. So several people only use a first name. One person only chose audio, and not video, and first name. And another person has opted to not have their video become part of the archive until 10 years from the time that she was interviewed. So they do have control over that. But I think for oral histories, that's not, and definitely many of the people I've interviewed have said, oh my God, no, when I was living in Portsmouth in the 80s, I was completely closeted and nobody knew I was gay, except everybody knew I was gay, but really nobody knew. And so they definitely do talk about those experiences. But I think for other examples, like the 1800s, early 1900s examples that Tom shared, I think it's a lot of that's another challenge of doing this work is how much evidence do you need? and so that's something that we always struggle with. The kind of presumption of heterosexuality and cisgender identity, and how much evidence do you need to tell a different story?
But I'll just say, I was just at the Historic New England Conference in Providence, and everyone struggles with that exact, the Beauport Mansion in Gloucester was owned by a gay man, plain and simple, he was gay. But they don't come out and say that. They'll just present the evidence, like, here's the letters that he was writing to his friend, It's just like Cheney and Matheson, they didn't call each other gay, they were in a relationship for 20 years. So it's kind of just presenting the evidence and letting the people, because that question of, do you out people in the past, and how do you really do that without their permission, But
and we had one example, when you just said out people, it reminded me at an exhibit we were doing, there was a raid, would you call it, a sting operation, in which many people were arrested at a popular cruising spot in Portsmouth. And we had the article from the newspaper, and we were deciding, do we leave it as is, because these individuals' names were published in the newspaper at a time when that likely meant losing their job, losing their home, losing a lot. And so kind of making the decision about whether to obscure their names, even though it's part of the public record or not, those are really challenging issues.
Oh no. Since we brought it up.
That's always a scary
I know.
Yeah, since we brought it up.
So I moved from Boston to Boise, Idaho in '69, and a book had recently been published. You may have heard of it. It was a national book called The Boys of Boise, and it was sort of like a McCarthy attempt to out a whole bunch of people in Boise, Idaho. So my question is, it'll sound simple and there's a complicated answer. What sort of persecutions? And also, how do you protect this archival material from future purges, persecutions?
I think it's a great question because, so I went through the Institutional Review Board process for work, research with human subjects, which is kind of a university-based kind of ethics review process that actually oral historians have a very uncomfortable relationship with that process because they don't really, so a lot of oral historians don't actually do IRB as a process, but the aim of it is to kind of really work through the ethics of any project, but not necessarily in a way that's looking at those particular questions, because you can consent to research at a given time in a given political climate without knowing kind of what might be coming next. And I think that's something that we don't have an answer for. It's people know that they're assuming a certain level of risk based on kind of what they've seen happen in the country and what they've experienced through their lives. And I think that's why a lot of people choose to still not use their full names. In the case of a recent Rainbow Symposium that we did, one of the participants, who I won't name, the first thing he said was, "Are there any reporters in the audience? And is anyone taking notes or recording this?" And so, you know, on the one hand, you might say, well, it's 2023. Is that really still an issue? It's very much still an issue for a lot of people, and not knowing kind of what the future will bring. I think a lot of people are concerned about that. And I think it's a reason a lot of people still choose not to do an oral history.
Well, I applaud you for what you're doing. It's complicated. It's important. In a sense, there's a lot of integrity that's coming to play. So.
It's also a lot of fun. We don't focus on that as much, but it's a lot of fun. And it's an incredible honor for me to be trusted with people's stories, and every time I walk away from recording an oral history, I just feel so overwhelmed and honored by the process and the trust. And in one case, one of the two of the people who have done oral histories have passed away after they recorded them, and in one case I was contacted by the person's adult child to ask if he could have a copy of it or he could have access to it, and that was really moving.
I remember you emailed me and said, "Can we do this?" And I said, "It's going to be in the public, so sure, give it to him."
I wasn't going to mention I emailed you because I was freaking out.
Right. And I think what's important thing about with the oral histories and Holly and having it go through UNH is they can get some funding too. It's easier to get funding to pay for some of the things like that new software.
Yes, thank you, Mellon Foundation.
Yes. Whereas we have,
that was on one of the slides.
We have no money, no.
And
I think
funding through that, and also funding to pay graduate students and undergrads to do research over the summer and over January term, and it's been so great involving so many of them and having them participate in that kind of intergenerational experience.
And I think more and more places are honoring the LGBTQ past and making it part of their exhibits or their collection. So it's going to be harder and harder to erase us because we're going to spread out as much as we can and get into every single organization and say, here, New Hampshire Archives, you need to keep this notebook from the very first political organization in New Hampshire, 1979 to 1982. And I always bring that up because I was very naive when I started this and said, we'll take anything. And we got everything. And I'm glad that I did, because there were things that were just going to be thrown out, like a notebook that had the very first political organization in New Hampshire, started in 1979 in Concord. It lasted 3 years. But if you look at that organization and look at the names of the people in there, you can trace them up to like 3 or 4 other organizations and say, there's that Jim again. He was back in 79, and here he is starting Gay Men's, New Hampshire Gay Men's Chorus, or here he's in this group, so it's really, I'm really glad that we saved all this stuff that was just, and we still, and the other thing is how people, like Holly said, they don't think they have a story. Everyone has a story, and people think their stuff isn't worthy of saving. Like, my stuff isn't important. We had one woman, this was at a Pride event, this woman came up and she's like, I don't have anything that you'd be interested in. And her partner goes, what about that box of stuff you have in the closet from the women's group you had in the mountains there in New Hampshire? And I'm like, that's exactly what's going to get lost. If somebody comes along and just throws out that box, there's a whole organization that nobody will know existed, So it's a lot of work, fun. It's a lot of fun. Yeah, it's great. Really good.
Thank you both very much. We really appreciate you being here. And Tom has a table in the back with items if you'd like to take a look.
Take a look at. And that's all extra copies, so that's the originals are in the archives.